everyone, and welcome back to the Page Turners. As most of you know, my name is Rosie Smollett, and I am the host of this intriguing channel. For those of you that are new, the Page Turners is a new channel that we created when COVID-19 hit. We realized that we wouldn't be able to have our in-person read and meet sessions, so we created a digital option. In this channel, we discuss books and how they relate to our world. You're very lucky to have joined us today because we're going to explore a book with a new global context that we've never talked about before. So I hope you're ready because we're about to start. To get us started, let's just talk about our book. This month's book has been 102 minutes and is written by two incredible authors, Jim Dwyer and Kevin Flynn. This book was created to tell us the unforgettable story of what happened on 9/11. It describes the events that occurred, as well as the urge to help and the fight to survive inside of these Twin Towers. This book allows us to get more of an insight on what happened on that tragic day and why it had such a huge impact on our country. So without further ado, let's dive into this global context. Okay, so the global context that we're going to be discussing today is dimensions of time and space. There is so much to talk about with this global context, and there are so many exploration points. The exploration point I chose for this book to develop today would be peoples, boundaries, exchange, and interaction. I feel like there's a way to connect every aspect of it with our novel, and I think that you guys will agree. But what does this exploration point even mean? We can explore people by looking at their stories before, during, and after the attack to see why the time and place had such an impact on this event. There are many different types of boundaries which allow us to look at different things that occur in the story to see our global context. Before I even started reading, I had already thought of a few boundaries that were broken, so I'll share those with you. This attack broke a terrorism boundary. At least for our country, terrorism was relatively new, and when the planes hit the towers, it opened our eyes to what the future could hold and help us prepare for future terrorism. The imaginary boundary line between the two countries was another boundary that was broken when the terrorists crossed from their country into America. Exchange happened every day in the Trade Center towers, so there was a ton of exchange happening in this setting. I also noticed that there was a lot of exchange happening between people in this book when they were all helping each other. Interaction was seen so much in this book, and it helped me learn that you can't save yourselves, let alone anyone else, without talking and interacting with each other. That is just a basic description and a few examples that should help you understand this exploration point better. Now that we've gone over each part of this exploration point, we need to talk about what this global context really means. To put it simply, we're studying two things: the time and place of the event, and how this event had an impact on personal and global history. The global context is interesting to me because you can analyze it from a shallow lens, but you can also dig in and analyze it even deeper through a personal, local, or even global perspective. This is what I did, and I recommend all of you to do. It helped me see and learn things that I would have missed otherwise. This global context includes exploring the turning points in humankind, which includes not just human discoveries, explorations, migrations, and innovations, but also points where humankind changed. Another part of my global context that is shown a lot in my book is the relationships and interconnections that I saw between individuals and groups. This global context almost completely covers everything in my book, and I noticed so many more things because of it. So we know how cool this global context is and how perfectly it relates to this book, but you're probably wondering, how do I know where to start with analyzing this book in global context? Well, I had the same question, but I had a great 9th grade English teacher named Mr. Johnson who taught me exactly how to do this. He gave me 2 starting questions that help not only start, but also guide my thinking during this book. To help you out, I'll pass along these same questions he gave me. First, how can knowing when an event took place in history be helpful? And second, how can knowing where an event happened be helpful? In my opinion, knowing when an event took place can be helpful because it can help us see the more direct impact from right after that event. I also think that knowing where an event happened can be helpful because we can analyze its event and its impact on a more direct scale. These questions allowed me to figure out the basis of my global context and why it's even important to look and explore it, and hopefully they do the same for you. Okay, so hopefully by now we all have a pretty good idea of how this global context works, but the main point of this digital book club version of a podcast is to discuss the book. To me, the global context is shown through the entire book. To be more specific, I think that the global context is shown through the journey of the characters because they each show parts of the global context by themselves, but when they're working together and facing challenges to find solutions, I also see the global context represented in my book. For example, taking one character, I can analyze so many aspects of this global context. I'm going to be using a character named Frank DeMartini. In the beginning of the book, it talks about his family, his social life, and his job, as well as how people knew him in the towers and why he was in the towers that day. Just in the beginning of the book, I not only began to understand this character, but I also saw the personal history of this character from a personal, local, and global perspective. As we move through the book, we learn about the number of people this hero saved as well as how he saved them, which included a lot of interaction. This shows the people and interaction part of my exploration point. Frank DeMartini also shows a boundary. A specific quote from page 88 shows a boundary that I didn't even think of. With a crowbar, flashlight, hard hat, and big mouth, DeMartini and Ortiz and their colleagues had pushed back the boundary line between life and death. This quote shows the boundary part of my exploration point and global context by explaining how he and his team worked together to combat this boundary. Lastly, towards the end of the book, the authors mention how Frank DeMartini gets minorly hurt. Almost everyone on his team was willing to help him, even though he didn't really need it. This shows exchange because it demonstrates a cycle and exchange of helping people. Frank DeMartini helped others, so others are willing to help him. There are a ton more examples like this in the text, but I don't have enough time to go through each one. Instead, I'm going to show you a few more quotes that I found that demonstrate and represent this global context in my book, and then explain how they do this. If you would like more information about how these quotes show my global context, check out the last page of the Google document that I share with all of you subscribers called Binder Pages. The first quote is on page 2, and it says, "As iconic structures, the towers could be seen for miles and miles. Their human pulse was palpable only from the inside out. This shows a turning point in humankind because the Trade Center towers were huge iconic structures that our country was incredibly proud of. When the planes attacked these towers, humankind changed, and our country has never been the same." Another quote showing exchange is through the example on page 278. It says, "The men of Ladder 6 regarded Harris as a guardian angel, a blessing who had arrived very much in disguise when speed down the stairs had seemed the safer choice. Instead, the halting descent had given them all an opportunity to continue on with their lives. Josephine Harris got help down the stairs, but as the firefighters helped her, it slowed them down, causing them to be in the perfect place to survive when the towers collapsed. This shows how each person helped the other through an exchange." Page 254 directly shows my global context because it explains why the time and place of this event was so important. The quote is, "To make skyscrapers more profitable and less costly to build, New York City had overhauled its building code in the 1960s, part of a national trend that permitted developers more flexibility in their choice of materials. I learned that the buildings were built in a time and place that was in the process of changing their building code to be less safe but more profitable. It would allow buildings to be built with less safety features, like stairs, and cheaper materials that burn easier. Since the time that the buildings were built was in the middle of the process of switching between the two building codes, they weren't thoroughly checked on either of these codes, meaning that they didn't have to try as hard to pass all the safety checks. Even if they had to strictly follow a code, they decided to use the new code, which allowed for less safety measures, features, and tests. This shows my global context because the time and place that the buildings were constructed caused them to be built in a more dangerous way, causing more deaths in the crash. It also shows a boundary because the rescuers had a harder time of rescuing people because there were less escape features. A boundary that I didn't think of was the boundary between conception and reality. The quote is that the buildings were collapsing not only was beyond expectation, it was beyond conception. This shows how many people did not believe it was possible for the buildings to collapse, and after they did, how that broke the boundary between impossible and possible, or the boundary between fantasy and reality. The last quote I'm going to talk about shows a boundary that I didn't think of. Page 227 says the rescue workers in New York City did not have a system for sharing that information. No common frequencies, no practice of working together at command posts, nothing they could count on beyond the serendipity of an encounter with someone carrying the right radio. There were other boundaries that I found in the text, but this quote shows how the lack of communication and interaction were major boundaries in saving lives. Basically, just remember that this global context analyzes many things, but it mostly focuses on studying the time and place of the event and how the event has made an impact on personal and global history. This book represents this global context through almost every page, not just through the action, but also through the characters, the author's diction, the problems and solutions, and all of the parts of our exploration point, such as people, boundaries, exchange, and interaction. So that's the end of this month's version of the Page Turners. I hope you enjoyed this book. I know I did. Since we're reading such an amazing and impacting book, I wanted to do something a bit fun and creative. Comment something that you learned or loved about either this book or this global context, and by the end of the week, I will randomly pick one winner to receive a free, autographed by the authors version of this month's book, 102 Minutes. Can't wait to see who wins. Hope you guys enjoyed and see you next month.